All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this Saturday morning. Hope it's beautiful where you are. Thank you especially to folks. I know that we've got some folks on the West Coast where it's very early, so thank you. Thank you to the authors and panelists. We'll get into this pretty quickly. My name is Jason. Just a quick, before we get started, if you want to share information with each other, you can use the chat feature. If you have specific questions for any of the panelists, you can ask a question, or you can, using the Q&A box. So please put any questions in the Q&A. And so with that, we're just going to get started. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host Amber, who's going to introduce herself. You're muted, Amber.
I knew I was going to do that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Vlangus. A lot of people may know me as Amber Speaks Up from my Twitter presence. And I just want to also kind of echo what Jason said in terms of welcoming everybody and thanking you for being here on a Saturday morning to talk about this very important multitude of topics, really. So I just wanted to tell a little bit, about myself. And one thing that I really don't enjoy is kind of putting people in boxes, labeling people. So, I, just like everyone else, am a very, complex individual with a lot of different life experience. So I really am excited about this conversation. Some of my life experience centers around having been a victim of sexual violence while I was serving in the U.S. military. And then some of my life experience really centers around harm from the state legal regime, if you will, and how the regime really harms family members of somebody who is required to register. So having said that, I don't necessarily call myself registry reformer only. I'm really concerned with a lot of different issues that really come into play when you start talking about the carceral state. Because yes, my family is harmed by the registry because my husband is required to register. But we also experienced a lot of things, everything from bail abuse to, prosecutorial misconduct, all sorts of things that kind of go along with the system that really has a lot of problems, has affected us. So I'm really excited about this conversation because I think we're going to talk about a lot of different things and how people are very nuanced, and it's a complex issue that we need to look at all the way around and really think about how we can all work together to really, at the end of the day, it's about ending sexual harm, stopping it in its track, and looking at policies that are really going to lead to that outcome rather than things that might make us feel good or things that might be politically driven. And we really want to look at, what are we doing and how is that affecting everybody involved? And most importantly, how do we make people and communities whole again? So that's kind of where I come from. So I'm going to hand it on over to Andrew, who I believe is next in the lineup.
Okay, thank you, Amber. My name is Andrew, and I am an Episcopal priest as a profession. And I learned in 2006 that one of my sons had a potential issue. And after learning that and dealing with it, I thought, including not reporting to the authorities, in 2011 when Homeland Security called me to say I needed to come home because they'd taken my son from the house, as well as basically gone through everything in the house looking for evidence. I began to understand that I was a co-perpetrator in a sense because of my denial that it could possibly happen in my family, that my own children could possibly be involved in that. And that began just the most shameful, painful time as the church hierarchy turned to look at the situation and investigate it almost in a criminal fashion, while the criminal authorities, justice authorities, were investigating my son. And that happened for both of my twin sons in short order in August of 2011. Later on in 2019, last year, after a civil lawsuit, a six-figure award to the victim in 2006, my being suspended by the church for 8 months, nearly losing my ministry, but being somewhat restored. Two young men came into the house, one of them holding an automatic at me first and then at my wife, demanding wallets, demanding the safe, which was really a joke. What safe? We don't have a safe. Then taking both of our cars, wrecking them. And then I began to be aware of what the victim's advocate side of this whole issue is like, and how, I don't know, just unpleasant it was to be treated as a victim by the state with all of its setup that went on. And all through this, my question that is still in the process of being answered is, so what is justice? What does justice mean for the 15-year-old who held a gun on us? What does justice mean for my son who received a sentence of 12 and a half years? Where is justice in a church that I've challenged but won't move a dime off of an incredibly obnoxious system for anyone who might want to even go and worship with them? So I keep going back to a particular text, and if I can be permitted to just share it with people, it's a repeat of a text from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures, Hosea 6:6. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. It's repeated by Jesus in Matthew 9:13 as he deals with those who were making some the standard outrageous judgments of the religious authorities. He said, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And in the complexity of our life, and Amber, you spoke to that beautifully, it's time for us to stop sacrificing people. This is an age, this is a time, this is just, yesterday was Juneteenth. All of us, in whatever role we have, wherever we are, it's time to end the harm and stop the pain. So it's an honor for me to be on this call. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. And I'm going to pass the baton to Tammy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tammy Bond. I'm in Illinois. I'm on the board of directors for a group called Illinois Voices, and we're also trying to reform sex offense laws, not only in our state, but throughout the country. Our ultimate goal, of course, is to end the registry completely. We know that's a big goal, so it's one of our long-term goals. I've been on the registry myself for 6 years now. And like Amber, which I did not know, I've also suffered military sexual trauma. So I'm like on both ends of the scale, and I compete with those two things, and it really wreaks havoc on my life at times, trying to fight on so many fronts, but mostly being labeled the sex offender, not even recognizing the rest of me as a person. So I'm just here because Erica's a friend of mine, and she's done some articles, and I think there's been some space for me in the book. And I'm glad to answer any questions anyone might have. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll turn it over to Eileen.
My name is Eileen Redden, and I am the president of the Connecticut Association for the Treatment of Sex Offenders, which is a name we've tried to change over the past several years because the association sees this as people who have committed a crime with a sexual component. And as many of you have said already, the definition is a demonization that our organization has been fighting against. The primary work I've done is in Connecticut prisons. I started in the 90s before the Registry even existed. So I have about 25 plus years working with inmates in our prisons and directing the program for about 12 years in the Department of Correction. So I currently have a private practice and, have gotten to know Amber and Jason, and they're doing tremendous work. So thank you.
Eileen. Thank you. So we want to start asking the authors questions. I'll take less than 3 minutes for myself. I was convicted of an offense in 2008. I was arrested in 2008, convicted in 2010. I've been on the registry for 1 month short of 10 years. I am counting very closely because it's a 10-year time. So in 1 month and 2 days, I believe it is, I will no longer be on the registry, but the harm has already been done for being on it. You can't undo being on the registry. So about 10 years after my arrest, I had never thought about being involved in advocacy directly other than just leading an honorable life and trying to rebuild it. When I found myself involved in a very big moral panic that was started in my town about me. It ended for nothing other than trying to do good things. Ended up in the local newspapers, the TV, and then it hit national news, and it was everywhere. So I said that I can't be silent. I have to step up and try to help. So that's 2 minutes on me. Today, though, we're here to talk about this book, The Feminist, make sure I cover it right, The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence by Judith Levine and Erica Miners. Judith Levine has written about sex, gender, feminism, and the ways that history, politics, and the economy feel in everyday life for 40 years. Her books include the award-winning Harmful to Minors, The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex. And Erica Miners is a professor of education and women's and gender studies at Northeastern Illinois University and the author of several books, most recently For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here. I'm going to have Amber ask the first question. You're muted again.
Muted again. So before I start with the first question, I really just kind of want to say, we're having a conversation. It's going to be very free flowing. We just happen to be having it, on the internet in front of, a lot of people or whatnot. So just kind of, we're just going to flow with it. So my first question that I thought it would be good to really kind of start off with is, in the book, you really frame feminism as part of the problem as well as what you call the key to the solution when it comes to state responses to sexual violence. Judith, I'll start with you. What do you really mean by that?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Jason, and everybody for having us. To begin with, feminism is not a singular. There are many, many different kinds of feminisms. And so we look at different kinds. There is one kind of feminism that in the effort, feminism has always been very, very concerned about sexual violence. It's really at the top of the agenda for every feminist. And early on, anti-violence feminists thought the way to go about taking it seriously and ending it would be to arrest a lot of people, give them long sentences, and then eventually the sex offender registry and the whole regime that we're talking about today. But at the same time, there are other feminists who recognize that simply locking people up was harmful. It's harmful to particular communities, in particular communities of color. It's harmful to women who are wrapped up in this stuff, who may accuse somebody. And so we recognize that a kind of feminism that we support has to care about two things. We have to care about interpersonal violence, and we also have to care about state violence. And the term that we use is one that Angela Davis coined, and that is abolition feminism. We want to abolish not just the sex offender registry and civil commitment, we want to abolish the prison nation. And thrillingly, there are a lot of people on the street who want the same thing. And we believe that in attacking both of these things, these two kinds of violence, we will move much more effectively toward a peaceful world in which we can express our desires, take care of one another, and have safe communities.
So how did you come to the viewpoint that registries in civil commitment should be abolished? Like, what was that journey like for both of you?
I can jump in. I also want to say thank you for hosting this conversation. And I also want to hear from some of the fabulous panelists. Tammy was a little modest in her introduction. She's an amazing local organizer, and I know has fabulous insights into this work as well. So I'm hoping that other folks will jump into the conversation as well. The question is about the abolition of the registry and civil commitment. I mean, there's no research as a faculty member, as a professor. I mean, there's no research that shows that the registry or civil commitment either reduces gender and sexual violence, changes the culture that we live in, that naturalizes forms of gender and sexual violence. So I think it wasn't a stretch, and as somebody who's done work for many years on dismantling the prison industrial complex, my community organizing, my scholarship, the projects that I've been a part of really demonstrate that criminalization and punishment are really not an effective response to many of the kinds of harms and violences that move in our communities, right? So for me, challenging the registry or pushing for the abolition of our sex offender registry and civil commitment is part of a commitment to ending gender and sexual violence. Because as a feminist, as somebody who wants to end gender and sexual violence, these state responses of criminalization, of policing, are not the pathway into building stronger and safer communities. Judith?
I think Erica and I come to this from two different movements that one of the points of this book is to bring these movements together. So whereas Erica comes from an anti-prison, an abolitionist place, my introduction to this was as a sex radical and as a person observing the moral and sexual panics of the 1980s and 90s, in which, I don't know how many people know about this, ordinary daycare workers and parents and clergy were accused of outlandish, bizarre, and really impossible abuses, sexual abuses of very small children. And hundreds of people went to prison because of the credulity of juries and the aggression of prosecutors. Some of them are still, we just heard yesterday from a guy who was in prison in the 1980s and just was exonerated. And so I saw, and I see, and I think we all see the regime that we have now as an outgrowth of that time, of fear, of a desire to protect children, a legitimate desire to protect children because even though there are all these false accusations, there's a lot of abuse, sexual abuse of children. And so it was this misdirection away from the real problem toward an imagined problem, which ended up, mushrooming bigger and bigger. And we see right now in the streets, the way that violence, police violence escalates violence. People are out there protesting, peacefully, and police come in. And so we see that the escalation of more and more and more, and the system has to justify itself by making us more afraid and continuing to circulate terror of the wrong things.
Thank you. So, I mean, related to the whole registry, we've had a lot of, oh, Eileen, somebody just changed here on the screen, so sorry. I'd like to bring Eileen into the discussion regarding what's going on in Connecticut related to the registry and the law, and trying to reform the law and kind of doing it in phases versus total abolition. Can you give some context around that, Eileen?
Well, there's very few people who have any political courage to tackle this and address it head on. And politicians are, once again, elevating the fear factor to get certain people elected. And when I think about the 80s, when I was working with victims, I worked in a local rape crisis center, and the stuff that I would hear was so outrageous, just like you were referring to, Judith. And the hysteria, I think, was really promoted and promulgated by right-wing politicians to get elected. So they wanted people to be afraid. They wanted an elevated police state and military presence in our communities. And they created the big fear factor that there's all these predators out there looking to sacrifice kids. Some of the cases that I worked on were just stunning in their bizarreness. So currently in Connecticut, I've seen the policy be no registry, and then we instituted registry, and then they grandfathered thousands of people into the registry. And it's been that way now for 25 years. And so in 2008, we looked to modify the registry. That didn't do anything. And now we have a Senate Bill 1113, which CATSA was very, very in support of, and any advocate for offenders, to start to modify the registry and based on a risk and not on the crime itself or the crime on paper. So a lot of people are overcharged, they plead down, and then their registry is based on that. So we're looking to change the registry to be evidence-based, number one, clinically based, and risk-based. Was that what you had hoped to hear from me, Jason?
Amber looks like she's ready to say something.
Oh, no, I mean, we're very obviously just geographically close and very involved in, advocacy in Connecticut. We have different ideas on what should and shouldn't be. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion around, is any registry a productive registry? If it's, bad policy is bad policy. And then we come into that conversation about incremental change that just kind of goes round and round in criminal justice circles. So I, for one, really feel that, the registry should be abolished. I'm very wary of risk assessment tools because, there's bias inherent in that. There's, racial disparities that are kind of baked into tools. So, and it also becomes about who is doing the evaluating, who serves on panels, creating a whole additional regime to do these assessments and manage. So my opinion is that we really need to keep pushing for no registry, but I'm not under any illusion that that's well accepted in political circles. So I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists around that.
Amber, just to weigh in, I completely agree with you.
I know.
In fighting this fight for 25 years and seeing no changes and no real fairness in our system, I realize that there may be small steps that we have to compromise on.
Can I jump in or?
Absolutely.
Can I jump in? I think that we're in an interesting political moment to think about the tensions between reform and radical or system or structural changes, just to sort of flip to this political moment where people are making demands to defund the police, right? And I think part of the win is the horizontal political education win that in my city, labor unions that are not carceral, people who, who have seen themselves as untouched by policing or have been neutral about policing are now sort of rethinking the normalness, the de facto kind of public safety role that policing plays. So I'm just sort of pushing here to say that grassroots organizing, should make the demand, should be doing the critical, political, horizontal education that registries don't produce public safety, don't end gender and sexual violence. We might have to compromise down the line, right? But the initial demand, the movements, the grassroots organizations should be making, in my argument and Judith and I's argument, sort of these radical, visionary demands, which we might have to compromise down on the road, but let's not start from a position of compromise, is the argument around social movements that I just want to lay on the table. And I think we have an amazing example of that right now as communities across the nation, largely led by decades of sort of Black radical organizing, are really getting some significant wins around thinking about defunding the police.
Right, and you're talking, when you talk about the moment, the other question that we had on our list was just talking about race in general when we talk about registries. And so, that's something that when we even when we look at Connecticut and we look at we have, we've been organizing and trying to pull people into the movement, and most of the advocates that we've seen either in Connecticut or across the country have been white. And so when we start looking at that and we look at the actual numbers of people who are on the registry, we see that the same issues with all criminal justice, that it's that's highly people of color, right? A high percentage. So can you speak a little bit? I know you spoke about it in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that also, Judith or Erica?
And I'd really love to hear from Tammy, who's been doing this for a very long time as well.
I was trying to jump in, but I didn't want to interrupt anyone.
Tammy, please.
First of all, I'm looking at the chat screen and someone talked about forgiveness. So I wanted to hit that first. I'm also for restorative justice. I think the two sides need to come together and hash out their feelings, their harm, and that to me is what gets the forgiveness started. There are going to be some people who don't forgive, but at least have that conversation, and at least you know why and how they feel and why they feel that way. I myself was not allowed to speak to my victim or in any of his family directly or indirectly, but it just so happened that his mom approached me in the grocery store, and I was really afraid at first because I'm like, oh my gosh, what kind of scene is she gonna cause? But she actually came to me and said she forgive me. And that lifted such a big burden off of me. And I was wondering, because this happened 3 years later, I was wondering, now what if this had happened earlier in the process? And then she also added that she did not at all know that all the things that were happening to me would be happening because she went to the police about this relationship. And so she apologized to me for that. She was like, had I known you were going to lose your house, you were going to lose all these rights and things, I would never have done that. So as far as forgiveness, I think that starts from a restorative place. Now, for people of color, on the other hand, as you see now, we've been oppressed and repressed for so long that a lot of the people of color that I speak to have gotten to the point where they feel like no one's listening anyway. So they're complacent to go on with life as it is because we've done it before, let's continue doing it. That's why I'm happy about what's taking place around the country right now. They're starting to get a sense of power within themselves, and I'm hoping that this spills over into also the registry and the people who are on the registry. I haven't taken up that fight yet. I haven't talked to people about that yet, but I'm hoping that will come up in the conversation. But basically, people of color are just at the point where they say, why? And even though it's affecting them and they see that it's affecting them disproportionately, and again, why? You know, they're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep being the scapegoat, you know, or what have you. And from where I am, that's the response that I receive. As far as women on the registry in my area, there's so few. As a matter of fact, I only know of one other person besides myself, and she comes off the registry soon also, but I'm on for life. Because my victim was under the age of 18. And I'm also labeled a sexual predator, even though I never preyed on anyone before.
Right.
Group therapy has been what's they found effective for sex offense treatment. Being that I was the only one within several counties around where I live, I had to do individual therapy. So I don't even know what to say about women on the registry. There hasn't been very much research. So I'm at a loss for where women fit in. Even when I went to get a risk evaluation, the doctor told me, he says, I'm really measuring you off the men scale because there isn't really one for women. So basically what I'm measuring you with doesn't even correspond basically with your level of risk because it's based on a bunch of men, not women. So that's where we are with that.
Just to make a comment on that, professionally, that's unethical to do a test and an evaluation on someone where there's no scientific efficacy.
It is, and I don't know how they get away with it, but he straight out told me that. And he also told me that if it wasn't for my current case, that current case that I had, he would have placed me at no risk whatsoever. But because of that current case, he had to put me somewhere. So he put me in the low to moderate risk range, which still to me was high, because low to moderate, who knows if I'm up to the moderate end or closer to the low end, or what have you. So I don't even like those evaluations.
It speaks to what Amber was saying, that when you have evaluators with certain bias, and obviously we have a lot of limitations, there's no appropriate evaluation for juveniles, but people do risk assessments for juveniles for juvenile court. And I just think it's unethical. When I do an evaluation like that, I tell the person's story. I don't talk about risk. I talk about their story and their protective measures, which is basically the good things in their life that will keep them as a productive citizen.
And I really believe that's why this therapist was open with me, because I don't think most therapists are that open with the people that they evaluate. They pretty much listen to you and then go on with their evaluation. But I told him laid everything on the table. I'm an open book. I tell everybody I'm an open book. I put myself out there. When people like Erica say, oh, you're so brave to do that. If I don't do it, who will? There's the saying that they did this and nobody came. They did that and nobody came. And finally it happened to me and there was nobody left. And that's how I feel right now. There's nobody left to come to assist me. And, I've done so much to advocate for others. But I will also say that prior to being on the registry, and this is what I try to say, this is what I always say, God does stuff for a reason. prior to being on the registry, I thought what everybody else thought, that those were heinous people that needed to be taken out of the world, put somewhere where they can't harm anymore. And then when I came on the registry and learned that that is not the case, I'm like, we need to do something we really need to do something about this, because I didn't even recognize that. So I think a lot of education goes into it, but people have become so familiar with the most heinous and media the ones the media puts out there the most are the most heinous ones, and they've become sensitized to that they don't want to hear anything else. So I think we have to find a way to educate people so that they understand what the myths are, and registries do not work. And then on top of that, I think we need to be more proactive than reactive. After a situation has happened, it's kind of too late. Some people can get help and be all right. I've been getting help for over 25 years and I'm still not all right, but I can live my life. But if it had been more proactive, because people knew about military sexual trauma and no one did anything but hide it under the rug. So I think we need to be very much more proactive.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you for sharing all of that, and thank you for all the work you've done. And also, you made a comment where who's going to be there for you. You've got a growing community. Because more and more people are seeing that we need to band together. There was in the Q&A, there was a question that someone asked: is there a way I can find out statistics with recidivism rates for Native Americans with sex offenses? If anybody has that resource, throw that in the chat. I'm going to move to another question that we had, which is, there seems to be a disconnect between what most religions teach regarding redemption and rehabilitation and how we treat people with sex convictions. And I know that you addressed that a little bit in the book. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and then maybe have Andrew weigh in also at some point in the answer.
This is a very interesting question. Certainly in certain parts of the country, especially in the South, if you come out of prison with a sex offense, or if you come out of prison, period, pretty much the only people you can turn to are evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians. And as you said, probably, certainly Christianity is based on the idea that everyone is redeemable. No one is forever sinful. And so on one hand, this is a religion that is trying to persuade people to be tolerant of all kinds of people who some have done really bad things, and at the same time, within their ideology, they're intolerant of homosexuality, they're intolerant of trans, they're intolerant of, all kinds of, of abortion, of women's rights. And so this is a real tension. And yet we talk to people, we recognize that religion is the meaning maker for probably a majority of people. So it's a very, very important part of people's lives. And so you can't write it off. And so we spoke to some very interesting organizers. There's a group called Connect up in Harlem in New York City that works with churches within the community, that works with people within the churches who have either been sexually abused inside of the church or by somebody else and the church has ignored it, and figuring out how to reconcile their faith with a very serious need to deal with themselves, help themselves, end the violence, and try to influence their churches and synagogues and mosques. So most religions are patriarchal, and that's a big problem. And that means that women are considered sexually evil, seductresses, and all the rest of it. Most of them are authoritarian, so that means that children have to bow down and do what they're told. So these are inherent in practically every single religion. And, so how do people within faith communities try to change their faiths or work within their faiths to be able to attack these very, very serious problems?
I just want to add one thing to Judith's fabulous response there. As I've been writing letters for people on the parole board for the last 10 years in various states and also in my state. And something Judith said when we were working on this project has stuck with me, is that we have no secular way to recognize redemption. That we have, the only way we think about redemption in the United States is through a Judeo-Christian lens. And I think that's very difficult for our criminal legal system. And as somebody who's sat in on many parole processes, how do we recognize that somebody has changed, that somebody is accountable, that somebody wants to shift in their lives? And I think our criminal legal Christian notions of redemption as well. And I think we need to sort of figure out a way to think about forgiveness. I just want to echo Judith's point that we can't give up on faith as an important tool for social change. It has been, it continues to be an important vehicle for systems change, for social change. But I also think we need to be talking and thinking about what secular forms of forgiveness look like or resemble. And I've been thinking about that since Judith made that comment when we were working on this project. How can we build that? So I'll just interject that tiny bit there.
Well, I want to ask, and thank you for saying that, Erica, that restorative and transformative justice do believe in redemption. That I think that
Right.
is our secular language of redemption. The very, like Brian Stevenson says, you're not the worst thing you've ever done in your life. And we allow people to be able to change and move and learn who they are. And so I think that's where the real promise is in those movements for practices that really, hold people accountable. We're not talking about just absolving. We're talking about real accountability, real introspection, real repair, and real change.
Yeah, I think we have our restorative and transformative justice world and our criminal legal world, and there's tiny little overlaps. But I do feel like our criminal legal system has, there's no way of thinking about redemption. There's no way of thinking about accountability that's not through the criminal legal, through a lens of punishment or through a religious lens. And I think Judith is absolutely right. The work and restorative justice work and transformative justice work is old work. It's not, we might be getting more visibility about those kinds of practices and organizing now, but those are old tools that many communities have used. So I just want to lift that up as something that the book reflects and engages in and is turning to for practices that we should be looking at and building out. So, yeah.
Chase, I think one of the big issues is the history of Christendom, which is the marriage of the church and the state, so that whatever the state wanted to get done, the church was, if you will, hand in hand with that. And especially the dualistic thinking, heaven or hell, sinner or saint, good and bad, black and white, just all of that didn't allow for the complexity of the human being and the human situation. And I think it's a hopeful time because of the collapse of some of those churches like mine, the Episcopal Church, that used to be part of the establishment. It wasn't a surprise that the church in Lafayette Square was an Episcopal church, the church, quote unquote, of the presidents. So because of the collapse and the change, and I think an opening there, I'm very hopeful that there's an opening for a crossover between secular society, partnership within those who are in spiritual communities of one shape or form or another, to move this forward. I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you, Andrew. We actually have a question in the chat from Janice Bellucci in California, and since it's so early in the morning and she's such an important player in this movement, we're going to read her question. The original target of the California Sex Offender Registry was gay men only. Because of that and other reasons, members of the LGBTQ plus community are overrepresented on the registry. However, members of that community continue to resist recognizing that fact and or to participate in the movement to abolish the registry. What can be done to reverse that?
I think that's a great question, Janice. Thank you for that question. And absolutely true. I think the lesbian and gay folks have been, especially mainstream organizations, have been on a march towards assimilation for decades. But I also want to lift up that we have, while there's that trend that mainstream lesbian and gay organizations have been on this march towards assimilation, and any association with criminalization is not the pathway towards being seen as, often we use the term respectability politics, to be seen as a full, respectable citizen. So while that is a trajectory that organizations, for example, like the Human Rights Coalition, have not I do think that we have to lift up organizations like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, like Black and Pink, which are LGBTQ organizations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, organizations that have a long history of speaking out against criminalization and policing, and they take an intersectional approach because they're also organizations that see race, anti-Black racism, gender and sexuality as interconnected. So I just want to lift up the fact that there are LGBTQ organizations that continue to both address issues around policing and criminalization, and specifically the overrepresentation of LGBTQ folks on the registry, and also try to make these connections between this historical marginalization of LGBTQ folks and the imperative of LGBTQ folks to speak out in this moment around it. So it's not, widespread as your comment, as your question really points to, but we do have some of this mobilization, in particular, a little bit more visibility now. And I think, so I'll zip on that one, but it's a great question.
I do want to mention that I see in the chat that we have an attendee who says, I work at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and I co-lead the Sex Offense Registry Reform subgroup of the LGBTQ Criminal Justice Working Group. So that's wonderful.
Yes, and I would be neglectful if I didn't flag the amazing work of that subgroup. Folks also like Trevor, who I see on the call as well. So there is while there's sort of the mainstream movement is towards assimilation, there are these little pockets of, I think, amazing and strong organizers that are trying to do this work. So yes, Tyrone, Trevor, and other folks. Great.
Great. Amber, did you want to ask a question?
I think I want you to ask a question. I put my sheet down and now I don't know where I put it.
So
I told you it's just a regular conversation on the internet.
Here's one. You talk about the state and its budget being an indicator of its priorities. Oh, yeah. What things do you feel are important to invest in as we explore the issue of sexual violence?
Say pretty much everything that we're not investing in and none of what we are investing in. I mean, the defund the police movement is about funding schools, parks, mental health care, housing, all of the things. And we know that family violence, vulnerability to violence, all of these things are connected to other vulnerabilities, such as lack of education, bad housing, crowded housing, poverty. All of these things leave people open to being harmed. And they are harms in themselves, that people don't have good housing, that they don't have excellent schools. So we believe very, very firmly that that a truly a community that really cares for each other, that looks at money as being shared by everyone, that doesn't go just to rich people, that rejects domination of every kind, that these are the conditions that will eventually reduce and maybe eliminate interpersonal violence. And also, if we get rid of the violence of the state, which, as Erica said before, condones and practices violence, that's another big part of it. If we have a massive military, we don't have enough money to do other things. If we have massive police forces, we don't have money to do other things. And also, if we have massive amounts of money going to the richest people, we don't have enough to do anything else.
Right.
One comment: educate our kids about sexuality from when they're young. Why are we hiding from the fundamental part of being a human being?
Yes, meaningful, affirming sexual health education is essential. I think there's not just one solution here, but one of the things that we do flag and we lift up throughout the project is, in particular, feminist and queer affirming, free sexual health education that is really meaningful and affirming. So absolutely, I think that.
I would really love to hear what Tammy has to say about priorities and funding in, communities.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was listening to Judith, and I was agreeing with her her assessment of that, and just wanted to point out, because a lot of people think that defund the police means get rid of them totally. I don't think that's what it means. I think it has to do more with less policing by police and more awareness of the community, of what's going on in your community. A lot of, at least Black community people in neighborhoods where I live, they just don't trust the police. They do not trust them. And what's the point of funding a system you do not trust? We do get the poorest communities and the Black and brown communities get the least amount of funding. The places that they can afford to live become places that no one else, wants to go to. There's some delivery people that won't deliver to certain areas or go in certain areas because of that. When we defund so much policing, I think that money should be allocated towards other social services. And I think somebody mentioned about not going to the richest people, but trying to assist the poor to overcome, because poor people don't want to be poor. They're just stuck in a system that's not allowing them to be poor. And I'll just point one out because of the pandemic right now. When they gave people that were laid off from work because of it the extra $600 a week until they can go back to work, no one wanted to go back to work because they were getting more money with the $600 a week than they were getting going to work. Same thing with welfare benefits. When you make a certain amount of money, they cut off your food stamps. So people would rather work less hours because the food stamps were providing more money than them working more hours. So it's not like people are lazy, they don't want to work or anything like that. They just are stuck in this cycle of it's not enough fun, it's not enough money is going into the areas that they need to go to. Hopefully I answered that okay.
Oh, you did a great job.
So we're coming close to the hour, so I want to make sure that we get an opportunity for Judith and Erica to add in anything else that we didn't ask that they'd like to say about the book or any upcoming projects or anything that you want to share with the groups.
We pretty much said it all. I mean, I think you asked us, Jason, 3 things that were the main point, and I could see if I can remember what they were. The first main point of our book is that there are 2 parallel and interlocking massive problems. One of them is sexual and gender violence, and the other is state violence. And the other is the state's response to sexual and gender violence. We're talking specifically now about the sex offender registry and all the rest of it. That feminism is a way of attacking both of these things, that feminism in its largest sense is in opposition to all kinds of domination, and that means personal, state, and everything in between. And the last thing is that we really believe that these various movements, the movements against the police and the prison nation, the movement of people who are on the registry for human life, you know, to get rid of all of these restrictions on them, the various victims advocacy movements, various feminisms, LGBTQ movements, that these, we have many, many things in common, that we can work together. There are real there are real conflicts. We're not trying to be all Pollyannish about it, but that the only way that we're going to be able to vanquish both of these things is for us to all work together.
Thank you. Erica, you want to add something?
Really appreciative of this conversation, and I do think it's organizing like folks are doing in Connecticut, like Tammy's doing here in the state of Illinois. That really is building the movement. So I think that more conversations like this, more dialogues, more opportunities to share resources. I'm seeing Tyrone is putting some resources in the chat box, and I know Janice is doing strong work in California. I think trying to always be working at the edges of our movements, trying to form coalitions, which, as the Sweet Honey and the Rock singer Bernice Johnson Reagan said decades ago, is home for no one, right? Is uncomfortable and requires us to do some unlearning and change. But I think that we win by building community, doing political education, trying to think of ourselves and our struggles in solidarity with other movements. And I think that this moment is such an opportune moment with a national dialogue around defunding the police, with people rethinking ideas of public safety and openly debating what makes our communities stronger and safer, that this is a political moment to ensure that conversations about registries, which are forms of policing and surveillance, are included in that discussion about defunding the police. Because if we're really invested in creating stronger and safer communities, we need to end gender and sexual violence. And how we do that is by challenging heteropatriarchy, challenging white supremacy, doing that kind of work. And it's not about putting more money into our registries and civil commitment. So I think it's a really important political moment for us, those of us that are invested in dismantling registries and ending gender and sexual violence, to turn and learn from the radical anti-Black organizing that's happening right now, and try to build stronger relationships between that work that's happening, and try to keep conversations alive, because I think there's a natural connection between the conversation that's happening around defunding the police and the conversation that we're having today. So how can we make those ties more visible? So I just want to put that on it. But thank you.
Thank you. So as we look to close here, I'm just going to say a couple quick things. Maybe Amber, you want to add in, but I'm going to look through the Q&A and try to capture the Q&A in the chat and see if there's anything we've missed, if there have been questions, and maybe try to email those, get answers for whoever's asked them at some point. I can't commit to doing that this weekend, but I will get that. I'll look at that. We're also going to be, we've recorded this session, so we'll make it available I'm not sure exactly what form that's going to take, but we will let folks, we do have the emails of anyone who's registered, so we'll let you know. Amber, what else you want to add?
So I did want to add that there is so much great work that's going on around the country, whether it has to do with registries or it has to do with ending sexual harm. And there seems to be like a lot of people just doing such great work. And I love the way, I just wanted to reiterate, I love the way the book really talks about those movements and how we can kind of build bridges with sometimes what would seem like unlikely alliances, if you will. And it's really an exciting time right now to acknowledge the differences and also really acknowledge the similarities. So, you know, and also I really just want to throw out into the world that there's no such thing as our movement, their movement. And, you know, what we really need to be talking about when we're talking about this is just in general, making, you know, I said it before, making people whole again. So making people whole again, making communities whole again who have been disproportionately affected by, you know, the criminal justice system, policing, sexual violence. I mean, we don't have enough time to get into, you know, all of those, you know, really in-depth issues, but, you know, non-reporting and just want to make sure that we're not, you know, this is not just an anti-registry discussion. This is a, how do we look at, you know, those who have been harmed, acknowledge that we delved a little bit into restorative justice, and how do we, again, make people whole again? So just really concentrating on those alliances and talking to people who we think don't agree with us, because 9 times out of 10, when you have the conversation, there are some disagreements, but then you realize that there's more human commonality than you actually think there is. So sitting around in a room talking to people that agree with everything that we say feels good, but it doesn't necessarily move the mark. So having conversations with people who you think may dislike you or completely disagree with you is really important.
Okay. So Amber, thank you. Tammy, thank you. Andrew, thank you. Eileen, thank you. Judith, Erica, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
This was wonderful.
We appreciate it so much.
Absolutely. And I'm going to watch the recording probably a few times. I'm sure I missed some things. So we're, like I said, we're going to make that available for folks. I think this has been a great conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.